So we're going to transition to Dr. Muhammad. Thank you so much for your time this evening, sir.
Can I hold 10 seconds?
Yes. Okay. Thank you for rushing here in the context of a late plan. So the question to you is, we know that Black history is magnificent, it's global, it's a history that includes many striking chapters of resistance and uprising against racial oppression, including the long civil rights movement, which grounds our understanding of the beloved community of what we need to do. Can you speak about the historical impact of the civil rights movement on today's struggle for racial, economic, and environmental justice, and how this history might help us better understand our current political moment?
Sure, thank you. And apologies, 2.5-hour delay. So unfortunately I did teach today. So,
yes.
And I have been listening, so I heard much of what everyone said just up until the last 5 minutes as I transitioned from the car to the space we're in. So it's an honor to be here with my friends and colleagues and people who are committed to this work. So thank you to Soma Action as well as to Soma Justice. With that being said, I think that there are a couple of key points I want to emphasize about the civil rights movement, and as Leah described, the long civil rights movement, which is a term historians have given to a much longer period of resistance that doesn't simply start with the Brown v. Board decision or with Rosa Parks protests in Montgomery, but reflects a commitment to an equality that was grounded in the material conditions of Black life and suffering that come with the end of Reconstruction. And I think there are a couple of things I want to do with how to think about this historically and its relevance for political and progressive organizing today. One, to be very clear, I think we always have to remember that the work of social change is always a minority project, and not in the identity or ethnicity or racial sense of things, but in the small number of people who do the work. And that is not to say that communities did not rally and come together in defense of their own or rise to the call to action when placed upon them. But by and large, if we look across the historical archive for the work that Black people did, work that I like to say today, which I didn't always say, and I certainly wasn't trained to think of it this way, as pro-democracy movements. Because the infrastructure of fascism that we often associate with the period of the 30s in Europe, whether Italy or Germany, that infrastructure is already in place in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And no longer a headline for most people, and certainly not in this room, but the Germans went to great lengths to actually study what was happening in this country, just as the Afrikaners did when the National Party won a major election in 1912 and eventually formalized apartheid in 1948. So when we think about resistance movements, we have to think of them globally. We have to think of the circuits of knowledge that existed amongst a small group of people. One of the more interesting aspects of the early 20th century resistance movements is that they were far more heterogeneous in both the nationality of those who participated and in the very U.S. white-black binary, very racially diverse, which is to say that one of the greatest threats to capital and one of the greatest threats of solidarity and working-class mobilization occurs in the 1870s and 1880s amongst agrarian workers. Some were landowners and farmers, others were farm laborers. A kind of populist movement that represented an interracial solidarity movement that did pose a real threat to the southern gentry and capitalist elites. Many of us know what that looks like in terms of the stories of labor struggle and strife over railroads and monopoly power. They give us a formal period we call the Progressive Era in the early 20th century. So why do I give this big frame? Because if we are thinking about a blueprint today, we have to remember that the pressure to use racism as a wedge to divide and conquer these groups is not just a story that exists in the Trump era in the way that we think about it. And it's not just an old story that we might know of difference between indentured servants and enslaved people. But in fact, it is an ongoing, shape-shifting reality because the consummate threat of white people choosing allyship or choosing common cause with black people is what this is really all about. The sheer dominance over black people is one problem, and the ability of black people to resist amidst the sheer terror of violence is another thing. But the propaganda that exists, the power of fascism, is really a power directed to a majority population of white people in this country that have always held the people power capable of overturning the system.
Yes.
And this is a fight for their hearts and minds. Now, why does that matter? Because the civil rights movement packaged its resistance in the tropes of American exceptionalism and constitutionalism as a rhetorical strategy to compel white people to see their history as on the line. If you believe in your own country, you have to side with us. That came with it great moral power and urgency, but it also came at a significant cost. Because in the legislative victories of that moment that we celebrate annually, particularly with the Selma March, which drives me crazy these days because the last 10 of them have been in the midst of a massive retrenchment and state violence against black people, and yet we still go to Selma as if what we're commemorating still reflects the reality that we had when the Voting Rights Act itself has been gutted. That's another conversation. So this trade-off in rooting the civil rights movement in a kind of story of a community who deserved their citizenship on the very terms that the nation promised them, and that the nation set on paper. There's a famous King line: "Be true to what you put on paper." Left us in the wake of those legislative victories with a very narrow understanding of how to measure success after that moment, and that narrow understanding was not necessarily a uniform understanding within the movement itself amongst the many constituents who had fought to varying degrees for both legislative victory, but for something even more expansive about a different kind of America, an America of true equality and egalitarianism, an America that recognized that a lot of this is old tropes, but that people, it was as much important to be able to buy a hamburger at a lunch counter than it was to sit at a lunch counter. This is sort of one of the ways. But the economic roots of the populist threat of the late 19th century, and what I didn't mention, the more popular front socialist threat of the 1930s, which brought FDR into a sharper focus. If I'm going to save capitalism, I'm going to have to socialize our economy.
Yes.
Johnson did the same with Medicaid and Medicare. That threat that was generated by the power of white Americans to tell America, through the perspective of black people, this is not the country we want to live in any longer, was more or less a project that was crushed both in the federal government attack on the Black Power movement, which emerges after the Civil Rights movement, but also in the ideology of individualism that emerges in the wake of the Civil Rights movement, that translates progressive possibility into personal responsibility as the currency of what a post-civil rights America was really all about. And as a consequence, I would say, and I'll stop here, go into other, but this is the big takeaway, that these resistance movements were always small to begin with. But if we imagine that the civil rights movement had solved what progressives imagined a different America could look like, it did anything but. It ended up reinforcing that you could paint a vision of a multiracial America by airbrushing black people into it on the very terms of which they had been excluded. Only now you would have black faces in high places standing in to represent this vision of a multiracial America. Not progressive in any way, shape, or form. And indeed, the insidiousness and the deliberateness with which Nixon himself adopted an idea that we can actually save the system as it is by using an old colonial process, which is to take the indigenous, pick off some small portion of them, empower them, give them, back in the colonial period of the transatlantic slave trade, you give people titles as chief, give them stools to sit on to make them powerful, cover them in jewelry, and all of a sudden they do all the work of controlling the natives that the colonizer no longer has to do. And it sounds cynical, but actually that's how it works. So we have to keep in mind that this tactic worked in the post-civil rights era. A lot of black people showed up in places for the first time only to represent a party of one. Only to be the first and the last who sat in that position. Maybe a second and a third at some point. But that wasn't the intended goal. And also, as James Baldwin often would say, that the price of the ticket was full assimilation to destroy your identity, your sense of self. And, I mean, I'm using a lot of glib language here in the interest of efficiency, but basically, when you're sitting at the table and someone hands you the menu, and your people are on it, you don't get to change the menu. Or you don't get invited back to the party. So we are struggling with the Obama era, in my opinion, representing the culmination of this strategy that took place after the 1960s. And we will never agree on how conscious Obama himself was of this, but I will tell you, as someone who at least is trying to pay close attention to Obama, when I listened to, I'm sorry, I did listen to it, but when I read, which was an audible book, his biography, the first installment of his autobiography, Obama makes it plainly clear that there's nothing that we're having a conversation about tonight that he doesn't know, but he chooses to fundamentally believe that the American project, as he understands its history, is perfectly sound. That it does not need reworking. It just needs to live up to its potential. And there are many people who believe that it cannot work on its potential because its potential was subsidized by the lives of people whose bodies and whose land were the fuel to create the thing in the first place. And this might sound abstract, and maybe we can end this conversation down the road with a progressive blueprint that recognizes that fundamental tension. But that in and of itself would be progress, because we're not even teaching that fundamental tension. All right, I'm sorry.